David Oransky is a financial planner based in St. Louis, Missouri. Over the course of our conversation, David and I talk about changes in monetary policy over the last 100 years and how these changes led to present states of inflation and ways that the individual can hedge against these changes through technologies like Bitcoin. Before that conversation, I'd like to thank the supporters of this podcast. The first is Noble Lore. Noble Lore is a company that makes podcasting as easy as it can possibly be. You sit down, have a conversation, and they take care of everything else. The other supporter of this podcast is Legacy Interviews. Legacy Interviews is a company that records individuals and couples' life stories so that future generations can know their family history. I'm in their studio right now. Now on to my conversation with David Oransky. David, what do you wish you knew about the economy when you were my age?
Austrian economics, both because it gives you an intuitive framework to understand how the economy works, but more importantly, because it helps you personally make decisions in your own life by focusing on the things that actually matter and the things that you have some degree of control over.
What are the things that actually matter that most people aren't paying attention to but should be?
I'd start with maybe easier to understand, like, what is an economy and what are the two kind of general schools of thought there. So an economy is just a system of allocating scarce resources for people's wants and needs. And so that consists of production, making things, consumption, and exchange, between those individual actors. And so you have then mechanisms like prices, contracts, and ultimately money that are coordinating all that effort. And in the conventional view of economics that's influenced by John Maynard Keynes, often called the Keynesian school, which is what most of our modern society is built upon and understanding in our models, is looking at everything in aggregate. So what's aggregate demand, what's aggregate supply, what's aggregate output, also known as GDP, and a lot of it with the goal of using policies, whether that be interest rates or inflation targeting, to maximize employment, minimize unemployment. Contrast that with the Austrian school, which views it much more on an individual basis. So it's looking at what are individual human actions. It's a bottom-up approach of what is every individual doing that brings this about. It's an emergent phenomena. And there it's focusing on you're not so much using price as a tool of manipulating price, but price emerges from this and is the signal that helps coordinate everything. And so as an individual, it allows you to focus on what is things that I value. It assumes that value is subjective also, that there's price and there's value, and that everyone will value things differently. And then although we have this sense, and it's often said that like price is the aggregate, takes all this information, aggregates it together, and you get this price. In some ways that's true, but you can't reverse engineer that. If you know the price of something, you can't then extract all the information that went into determining that price, and you don't need to. That's the beauty of it. It's really, you've compressed all that information down to only the price, and you as an individual actor don't need to know what anyone else in the economy is doing. You just need to know, do you value that thing more than what it costs? And if you don't, then you don't transact in it. You don't buy it. And so that can filter down into business decisions, but also a lot of personal decisions. When you're going to buy a house, you don't have to think about, well, what's the economy going to do? Are the prices going to go up? Is this going to be a good investment? What do you think it's worth? Let me talk to my realtor. Is this a good value? And yes, you should check comps and make sure that can't buy, that the opportunity cost is good, that you can't buy something else that would satisfy your needs and wants just as well for a lower price. But once you've achieved that, it's like, am I going to get the value that I want to out of this life? Then I don't much care what someone else is willing to pay for it. It may not be as valuable to someone else. It can matter for, business decisions of, who you want to partner with, who you want to work with. It allows everyone to kind of make their own individual decisions and not kind of top down dictate what everyone should be doing to bring about some policy metric.
And so as far as what the bull case for Keynesian economics is, why did we switch from, would it have been fair to say that we, as the United States at least, operated based off of a more Austrian model pre-Keynesian economics, and what was the
Yeah.
bull case for why we would have switched to Keynesian economics when we did?
Yeah, in the at least the early days of the US, I think you could argue that we naturally followed more of an Austrian school, but that wasn't because we decided
We
that's
knew,
the school of
we
thought.
knew what it was.
Keynes wasn't even alive then. It was more just what naturally emerged. The US was, a bunch of people all coming to, this idea of self-reliance and, making their own futures. That's just kind of what naturally emerged. And it wasn't until what really precipitated it was there was earthquake in 1906, 1907 in San Francisco. Tons of houses destroyed. Most of those were insured in London. So lots of capital then flowing from London to the US for all these insurance claims. That was creating issues in the UK for their currency. So they increased interest rates to pull capital back into the UK, which caused, a panic in the US. And suddenly, everyone that had mortgages or loans out was, there was a financial crisis here. And whenever there's a financial crisis, people look to policymakers, to the government for basically a bailout. And, the system was on verge of collapse, and JP Morgan came in and, was the hero of this story for kind of rescuing, by injecting liquidity, rescuing the country here. But in exchange, on the tail side of that, it was how are we going to prevent this in the future? And of course, the solution was to create the Federal Reserve, which then ultimately was the step that started delinking the US dollar from a hard money system, which is kind of hard money would be kind of the basis of an Austrian school of thought. And I think you can trace a lot of the symptoms that we have today back to the creation of the Federal Reserve.
And so the idea is that instead of having to rely on an individual actor like a JP Morgan to inject liquidity into the system to save it from this collapse, you would have a Federal Reserve that had some amount of liquidity to inject into the system in times of need. And what other reasons?
Yeah, but I think whenever people are experiencing financial pain, they want the government to bail them out. And there is often a general feeling, and I guess you could argue that this is how most people would vote, that, stealthily take a little way of my purchasing power or steal from future generations to help me today. And people will always vote and choose for them receiving things and often ignore the cost. Those are kind of externalities in the system. And
let's unzip that, because most people are not going to find that intuitive in terms of like, how is the Federal Reserve stealing away your future potential savings or buying power?
Yeah. So going back to the most simple level, like if you have certain requirements to live your life, you need to find shelter, you need to find food, you could go do all these things yourself. You could build your own house, you could grow your own food. If you did that, you'd have a much lower standard of living. So you will always choose to find greater value in this world. And typically that is through trade, through exchanging with others. You can specialize in some skill and you can produce more of that thing, and someone else can produce more of another thing. And in aggregate, you can create more. And so there's more wealth to go around, more goods and services to go around, and everyone's better off. And the future is inherently uncertain. And so one of the ways that you can reduce that uncertainty is by saving. And so in the simplest world, you could save food in case, there's a bad harvest in the future, or you can't find, any game to, hunt and eat. And so you save. And if you don't want to have to save everything you need, you can instead save money, which then gives you maximum optionality to go procure whatever you need in the future. And so money is kind of your own human energy labor that you have deferred consumption for. You chose not to consume that at the time you produced it for the future, and you've saved that. And when you have a central bank that is able to inject liquidity, what they're really doing is diluting the supply of money. They are effectively printing more money and more units of that, but they're not making more goods out there in the economy. They're just creating more money. And so all you're effectively doing is changing the exchange rate between those goods and the amount of money. The money is now less valuable, but you've put it into the hands of people that are willing to go spend it and stimulate the economy. But that means anyone who's saved has now had their savings diluted. And so it's not printing money does not create wealth. It just redistributes it.
So following the creation of the Federal Reserve, what was the next most important change in monetary policy that got us to where we are now?
Yeah, so when the Federal Reserve was created, the U.S. was still on a gold standard. So at that time, the dollar was actually redeemable for gold. It was about $20 an ounce, and you could go to the bank with $20 and exchange and get a 1 ounce, gold coin. So think of it like the coat check. The dollar bills were literally just your ticket to go get the gold. It was so that you didn't have to carry around heavy gold in your pocket. You didn't have to worry about that money. It was a convenience thing. It allowed money to move around much faster. And the gold stays safely in a vault, and you just exchange around these paper tickets for it. And when the Federal Reserve came, they were supposed to have, I don't remember the exact percent, but I think minimum they had to have 35% of all the dollars had to be backed by gold. But at that time, it was like 85 or 90%. Like it was kind of like, oh, don't worry, we have these powers, but we don't need them. It's a just in case. And it didn't take long for that just in case scenario to come up where they had to quickly print a lot more dollars. And that was World War I. And whenever you have a fiat system, which is, using paper currency that's not directly backed and redeemable by gold, but the Federal Reserve was the first step of that by creating a fractionally reserved base money kind of system, which now enabled the U.S. to fund a war without having to tax people. They could instead print the money by borrowing money from future generations. So people don't feel the immediate pain, but they get the immediate benefit, I guess you can say, of war, if you call that a benefit. In their mind, it was at the time. And you defer that future consumption, or you defer the actual payment of that. And so that was step one. And then those excesses led into the kind of roaring 20s where you get lots of leverage and a collapse, and then we need another bailout. Well, people started to realize that there wasn't enough gold in the system, that if everyone went to the bank and redeemed their dollars for gold, there wasn't actually enough gold left. And so they had to, close the gold window. Sorry, temporarily, banks closed. You're not going to be able to redeem your gold. Well, that temporary restriction quickly turned into a permanent one where they made it illegal in 1933 for U.S. citizens to actually hold gold. It was illegal to hoard gold. You had to turn it all into the bank and take the IOU. But don't worry, it's still backed by gold. You just can't redeem it right now. Well, then a year later, in 1934, they devalued the dollar. So instead of being $20 to an ounce of gold, it was now $35 an ounce, and you still couldn't take it out. And people were freaked out. So then they came out with the FDIC and said, don't worry, we're insuring your deposits so you don't have to worry. And then we went on with that system for another 35 years or so. And during that period, other countries were still able to exchange their dollars for gold, just not U.S. citizens. And then what happened? And so coming out of World War II, where Europe was in shambles, and the countries there didn't want to store their own gold because they were worried that if they were invaded, that gold could be seized. So everyone had sent their gold to the U.S. The U.S. is sitting on a huge amount of gold. They're exchanging that gold, their dollars for gold with other countries. And other countries were starting to realize, hey, this system isn't really sustainable. There's not enough gold in the U.S. vaults for all these dollars that they've issued. We're going to go pick up our gold. And as the story goes, France was sending over a battleship to pick up their gold. And it was while it was in transit that Nixon said, gold window's closed. We're no longer exchanging our dollars for gold. Everyone go home. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Is this the what the fuck happened in 1971?
Exactly. So in 1971 is when we went to a pure fiat system where we no longer even pretended that the dollars were backed by gold. It's just like, sorry, you keep your dollars. We're going to, it's all backed by treasuries and we'll manage it. But at that point, this comes back to, individual actors in the economy. Like Nobody had gold. All U.S. citizens had turned in their gold. Obviously, some people had kept gold and kept it quiet for decades, and that's why you hear like people in our, grandparents' generation talking about hiding gold coins in the basement and burying them. It's like, who are these crazy people? It's because it was illegal to own. So then, after 1971, it was just everyone kind of chose the dollar. There was no other form of money that people were using that was better than the dollar at that point. The entire system was set up on dollars. There was global commerce. You can't move gold around quickly. And so the marketplace somewhat chose the dollar in addition to being coerced. Like, it wasn't like there was another solution at that point that would have worked better. And so, we kind of got away with it. There isn't a time in history where we just decided to start using fiat money, though, because we thought it was better. It was always starting with this trust that emerged naturally, like gold, and then kind of pulling the gold out from underneath. That's what's happened throughout history. It happened again in 1971, and we've been on the dollar since, and the dollar has been the cleanest dirty shirt of all. And I think it's only in recent, decade or so that we've started to see some of the pressures of that breaking. Because when you're in a pure fiat system that's all based on credit, meaning like what's at the bottom of the system, it's no longer gold. And so often I think of like, what's the difference between money and currency? And we often use those terms interchangeably. But money is, at its base level, an asset that is no one else's liability. If you hold a gold coin, you're not relying on anyone else to make good on that. Like, it is what it is. It's an ounce of gold, and that's what you hold. Whereas currency is a liability of somebody else's. You're expecting that someone else is going to make good on their promise, so that that's valuable. It's an asset to you. It's a liability to someone else. And so in our current system, you have dollars, which are backed by U.S. treasuries. U.S. treasuries is debt of the U.S. government, and that debt is denominated in dollars. So the U.S. government is promising to pay dollars, and those dollars are backed by the debt. Like, it's a circular reference. It's like, okay, well, what backs that? Nothing. It is literally circular all the way down. And which means that if someone doesn't pay off their debt, that means someone who has an asset on their balance sheet, maybe their retirement account, no longer has that asset there. And the whole system contracts into deflationary collapse. And we get like a Great Depression type scenario, which is why economists are terrified of deflation, because the system has to constantly be expanding or it will collapse. And so nothing in this world can grow exponentially forever. It will always collapse, and it always has in all of history when we've tried to do this. The question is just when. And it's only in recent years that people have started to really be concerned that maybe are fractures in this. And maybe that, although it seemed really good that we've had the world's reserve currency and that all these benefits, like we can print money and buy real things with it, that are realizing maybe that's actually, there's some downsides to that also.
Are you okay to talk about the dollar milkshake theory?
Yeah.
That seems like a good segue into what might be going
the dollar.
on there.
Yeah. So just for context, the dollar milkshake theory is, so Brent Johnson is a portfolio manager, really kind of a gold bug, but one that tried to kind of understand what this dollar, most gold bugs will give you a much more colorful version of the story I gave you, the Federal Reserve, and how everything's corrupt and everything, gold is the future, gold is the past and gold is the future. And one day we're going to wake up and everyone's going to be back on gold. And Brent Johnson's theory is that, well, that may happen. And he is definitely a long-term proponent of gold, that the way our monetary system is structured, people are kind of at this point forced into the dollar. Because the dollar is used for most trade in the world. Most contracts are denominated in dollars. So even two countries, that are not the US, just two random countries, if they have any sort of agreement, it's likely denominated in dollars. They owe each other dollars. And so if you want to, the idea of like paying off our debt sounds great, but if we pay off the debt, that means there's now a huge demand for dollars, and the value of the dollar goes up, which makes things way more expensive for everyone else in the world. And it actually accelerates the pain that they will all be feeling, that if everyone's acting in their best interest, they're going to continue to use the dollar for the time being. As much as they want to get off it, it causes so much pain to go there that the dollar, everyone's kind of trapped in this dollar system. I think there's a lot of truth to it, but I think there are other levers that can be pulled that may get not play out exactly as he thinks it will. But I think understanding those forces, especially in the short term, is important. That, like, although there are all these problems with the dollar, I don't see much likelihood of us switching to the euro or switching to the Chinese yuan. Like, I really don't see those as solutions. And I don't think most market participants are going to choose that. As much as they hate the dollar, it's better for them to continue doing it for now, at least.
When did you, proceeding down the traditional financial path, come across the idea of Austrian economics, and how did this change you after you came across this set of ideas?
I was familiar with pieces of it, but not in any sort of cohesive way. So, I mean, I can think back to my real first introduction of it was probably like middle school social studies with, like Ron Paul being this, crazy candidate, or like presidential elections, and trying to like learn about all the candidates in like 6th and 7th grade. And like, this guy's got some weird ideas that I find interesting, even though everyone else thinks he's weird.
Why did people think he was weird?
Oh, because he's talking about how the Federal Reserve and gold and all this stuff. But I just remember thinking a lot of what he said made intuitive sense to me. But I didn't like go down that path hard at that time. It was like those lessons, as I started studying Austrian economics later, was like, oh, this all makes sense, and tied back to that. For me, it was, so I studied economics and accounting in college. And so I had little bits of exposure to it, but it was predominantly like a Keynesian methodology, especially when you get to macroeconomics. And I actually always enjoyed microeconomics, which is looking at the individual companies and firms much more. And the Austrian school, in my mind, is literally just taking microeconomics and expanding it upward rather than thinking of it as a separate discipline from macroeconomics. But probably my first foray down deep into that rabbit hole of like how things got created was actually, my brother had read a book about the creation of the Federal Reserve and kept calling me with all these, what seemed like crazy theories about this. And it's like, I don't think that's how it works. That's like, and finally I was like, fine, I'll read the darn book. And I read it and I was like, that can't be true. And then I'd go like kind of Google it and try to independently verify. I was like, well, it's at least somewhat true. Like, I didn't realize that. And I didn't do much with that. I mean, I started to then explore gold as an asset to hold on, in someone's portfolio. Before that, I would say, yeah, if it doesn't have cash flows, why would you want to own it? It's not an investment. Like, you put an ounce of gold in your safe and 10 years later, it's still an ounce of gold. Like, that's boring. You need to grow your wealth to keep up. But if anything, looking into it made me realize that in time, that there have been many times throughout history where monetary systems change, and when people lose trust in the system, gold has been kind of what they restart the system with. And so as an insurance policy, maybe it makes sense to have a small amount of gold as insurance policy, a lot more than as an investment. And then around the same time, that would have been, in that 2017 era, was when, and it was 2017 in my mind, when I had clients, friends, family started asking about Bitcoin, and I was linking it, talking about gold. And so eventually I went down that rabbit hole and learned about that. And probably it was in my study of that I started to go deep and really learn what Austrian economics was. And I think for many people, that was their door to it.
And your brother, who you mentioned before, he came across Bitcoin before you, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually heard of Bitcoin in 2011. I had a buddy that emailed it to me.
Hearing about it in 2011 isn't owning it in 2011.
No, I definitely did not own it. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like, yes, that was like it was like $1 per Bitcoin back then. If I had bought Bitcoin in 2011, there's a very good chance I would have sold it. And I think that regret would sting a heck of a lot more than simply having never bought it.
Yeah.
So,
gotcha. I tell the story of talking to your brother about coming across Bitcoin quite a bit to people my age, because I think it resonates. And your brother has a oyster farm up in Maine, and you hooked us up to go hang out on one trip. And so I went up there with my whole family, and we were chatting and kind of talking about his experience coming across this. And he was like, well, I just realized in my early 20s that I was having to work harder and harder and harder to stay in the same place.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand why that was, because I didn't think that it was subjective or just a product of my age, that I was like getting more tired by putting in the same amount of effort. And so he's like, then I got into these ideas, like paying attention to what was going on in the economy and how the government was treating our money supply. And then I came across things like gold, and I wanted to look for what was the best way for me to hedge the value of my work against the inflationary behavior that the government is partaking in. And then that's when he came across Bitcoin.
Yeah. So he did like actually adopt it years before I did. And he was one of the catalysts that made me be like, okay, here's these people. And I had a few others that are like, these are smart people that I agree with on many areas of life.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem completely unpersuaded by my, talking points of, traditional finance of why to, avoid this thing.
What are those talking points, just for the counter take?
That it's a speculative bubble, that it's tulips, that it's a scam, that, what's it backed by? It's not backed by anything.
The tulip story is a good story. Unpack the tulip. The
claim. Actual tulip story.
Yeah, and then why it's not like the tulip story.
So tulips, this goes back to what year was this? This is like 1800s maybe. Do you know the tulip? You might know the tulip story better than me.
I don't think
I can give the overall theme, but I don't know that
Yeah.
I get all the specifics right. But there was basically this tulip craze where tulips got to be an outrageous price. And then there was futures markets speculating on it. It was this huge bubble that then popped, and a lot of people lost a lot of money and became famous as just this example of a mania where the crowds go crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't trust that. Prices aren't efficient. You need to be careful of following anything that goes up like that, and that doesn't have any substance behind it. And then people will liken it to Beanie Babies or, basically anything that's gone up a lot in value and then crashed. Well, just without even understanding Bitcoin, if you observe it, Bitcoin's the only bubble that keeps, resurrecting and then repopping. And most bubbles are driven by leverage, where the price goes up, people get excited about that. They want to make money. They see their neighbors, their friends making money. They want to do it. How do you turn a small profit into a big profit? You leverage it up, you borrow money, you figure out some way to do that. And then it gets over its skis to where there's not enough fundamentals to actually support the price it is. And people eventually realize that, and then it unwinds even quicker and crashes. I think the difference with Bitcoin is just looking at it, it continues, while it will likely still have these cycles due to leverage, it always finds a footing without a bailout. Like, it's like the perfect example of that Austrian school of economics of, rather than interfering and trying to manipulate the markets to save them, it's just let them emerge. And it's a clearing out system where all the bad debt gets cleared out, and then the base rebuilds. And as it rebuilds, it gets stronger and stronger. So you get higher highs and higher lows. So yeah, I expect there still to be big swings, but you're going to get that base keeps getting stronger.
If you were talking to someone who wanted to have the most basic understanding of Bitcoin, that's like, okay, I can wrap my head around the idea that this is digital gold, but I don't actually understand how it works. How do I know that my money is safe whenever I put it into Bitcoin? Where is my money going whenever I put it into Bitcoin? How do I know that I can sell my Bitcoin to get money back whenever I want? How would you talk someone through those aspects of it?
So I think I would start with that the form that money has taken over time has changed, but the function of money has essentially always been the same, and that is the ability to move value across time and space. Moving across time is that savings. You could do that even with yourself. I'm going to consume less than I produce today. I'm going to save that for the future. You're now moving that value across time, and that's kind of the store of value function of money that we often hear talk about. Like, if you open any sort of textbook or type it into Google or ChatGPT, like, what is money? There's often like 3 prongs that come up. It's a store of value, it's a medium of exchange, and it's a unit of account. And so that's kind of the store of value piece, the moving it through time. The moving it across space would be being able to move it from one location to the other, trade basically. That's the medium of exchange. And then the unit of account is like what we denominate in, literally like what do we name things? How many dollars does it cost? It gives us that standard unit of account. And so throughout history, over thousands of years, gold won out and became de facto money. There had been different forms of money used in different places. It had been livestock, various other commodities. It was glass beads in certain places. But any time that two societies that use a different form of money start interacting, eventually the harder money won out, and that over time was gold. Where gold lost its way is when the speed of commerce became faster than the speed at which gold could move. And so if you go back a few hundred years ago, trade was mostly in your geographic region. There was some intercontinental trade. But once we had the telegraph and could send information almost instantly across the world, business started being able to move at effectively the speed of light, and yet gold still took weeks to deliver. And then once it arrived, the only way to verify its authenticity was to melt it down. And so very quickly we had to abstract it with not just paper, but literally like journal entries where we just keep a set of books and say, okay, I'm in this continent, Ben's in that continent. Whenever we trade money, we'll have a bank that we both trust, and they'll just move money from my account to his account. The money never actually has to move.
And there would be thousands of people presumably doing this over any given period of time, and that bank is going to keep track of all of these transactions. Right. And then over some time period, they're going to settle the books.
And then these various banks over long periods of time will settle those trades by actually moving gold around. But that way, the gold doesn't need to move very often. Mm-hmm. But that also removes the discipline of making sure that you're not issuing more claims on that gold than there's actually enough gold to exist. Mm-hmm. Which inevitably happens. People take more risk, they leverage up, they loan stuff out, and then something bad happens and nobody likes to lose money. And so they look for, effectively a bailout. Because somewhat tying it back to your earlier asking about the dollar milkshake theory, like probably the best analogy there that ties into this is if you think of like base money, which used to be gold. It's a game of musical chairs, and the number of chairs are the amount of actual base money. Think of it as, gold back in the day. But the claims on those coins, call them the dollars, are all the people circling the chairs. And when the music's playing, everyone's happy, everyone's having fun. As soon as the music stops, everybody wants a chair, and there's not nearly enough chairs to go around. And so in a gold system, there's no way to create new shares. In a fiat system where the base money is basically U.S. treasuries, the U.S. government just borrows more money, or they spend more money through deficit spending to create more chairs so that everybody has a seat, and then they dilute the value of everything. And so then getting back to, the current system and, fiat money and how we went off the rails here, there was an inflection point where people had to choose, do I want to use gold as money, which is a better store of value, has some discipline, but which I can't send across the world quickly? Or do I want to trade? And trade is where real wealth is created. Well, then I have to use this fiat system. Mm-hmm. And so people chose dollars because they wanted to trade, and they trusted the banks to actually keep the gold there. And obviously we talked about that trust was broken. And now we're in this weird position where our money's not a good store of value, but it is a really good medium of exchange still. And I think this is what ultimately leads into Bitcoin, is Bitcoin kind of took the great qualities of gold, namely its scarcity, but allow it to actually settle, to move across not just time in the store of value, but across space faster than anything, including dollars. We all think of dollar transactions as instantaneously. When we put something on a credit card, it effectively happens instantaneously, but behind the scenes, it's taking weeks for that money to actually settle. With Bitcoin, you have final settlement in, less than an hour. 10 minutes, you can verify the transaction. After an hour, it's pretty much immutable.
I've had to send money overseas for years for overseas contractors. And it was probably I think it was the contractors I worked with in Nigeria that were more on Bitcoin than even I was at the time. Yeah. And this was a couple years ago, that they were pay us in Bitcoin, because things like Payoneer or like PayPal, like these things don't work if you're paying
Right.
overseas contractors. And I'm working with programmers, right? So they're like, we want to be settled in Bitcoin. And like even now, it's like if I'm working with someone like that overseas, that's the preferred medium of exchange. And I mean, I was even like paying for stuff for my wedding a couple of
Yeah.
months ago, and I fired some money off over to France, and they on their end needed to, I guess, accept this or something like that. Like, I don't know enough about their system, but they were like, oh, we have a 3-day window where we needed to like accept the money, that this was like an actual business dealing that we did for our business account. And because they didn't, it was just kicked back to my bank. And when it was kicked back to my bank, because of like it needing to be exchanged from US dollars to euros going there, and then like I guess euros to US dollars coming back, I wasn't able to find it from the amount of money that was sent, just in terms of like the exact amount of money that was sent. There were so many levels of infrastructure, because it's one thing, to your point, with like credit cards where we're dealing inside of the United States system, but doing this internationally, I guess there were so many different levels of like these different banks that it needs to go through to get from like my bank in the United States to this one other small bank in France, that the money literally got lost. And my bank did not have an incentive to work with me to try to get it from an investigative perspective, because they're like, you sent it and we don't know where it came back. So sorry. And their bank didn't have an incentive, because like it never hit the account of their person that they accepted. And so here I was in the middle, having to like play detective and yell my way through different levels of like bank administrators to be like, you need to give me someone with more power, because I'm trying to find my money. And eventually it was found through like, I don't even remember the code. And then I had to go back to my bank with this code, and they were like, oh, you know what? We found it. We have used this code to track it down to the money that made it into like our net account. We can reassociate this with your account. And then it was reassociated with my account, like minus, dozens of dollars.
It's a very archaic system, and it's built on layers. Like, you're not directly sending money to the vendor, in Europe. It's got to go through your bank. It gets aggregated with a bunch of other transactions. They're then, sending an international wire to some other central client. So there's all these layers built upon it, and each of them is really inefficient and uses different technology. And things happen all the time that go wrong all the time. And I think what Bitcoin has the potential to do is become that base layer, that base settlement layer, with a singular unit of account, where it's not converting dollars to euros. Like, that stuff could still happen on higher levels. But if you're just trying to send, ultimately what people are going to want is what's at the base of the system, which is Bitcoin. And that, much like it used to be on gold, except that we have figured out ways to perfect that much better, where the pitfalls that gold had, Bitcoin solves for. And it does it, I think, better than the existing fiat system. So you're kind of rebringing the medium of exchange and the store of value back together in a way that's better for both. There's always trade-offs in this world. And before we had the trade-off of, store of value, gold, or medium of exchange, the dollar. And it takes a new technology to push you further out on that indifference curve, where there are still trade-offs between security and privacy and all these things. But Bitcoin is better than either of the older systems. And so it's just a matter of time of people realizing that. And kind of to your point, I think it's much harder for the average American to recognize this than it is for people in other countries, because we have the most functional, or at least least dysfunctional monetary system, probably, than the rest of the world. And so until people experience some sort of issue that makes them realize something is broken, they're focused on other stuff. Whereas people in other countries, they tend to experience much higher inflation. And so they're already using things like the dollar, if not Bitcoin, as a better store of value. So they're already thinking outside of the system. And, here we are, the fish in a pond, and wondering what water is.
I saw this thing the other day that was kind of chilling, because it was tracking stocks in the early days of the Weimar Republic in Germany. And it was like, if you were a person who lived in Germany and you were, denominating your stocks in marks at the time, in the early stages of this, you might have thought that the economy was doing very well, because the value of your stocks in exchange for marks is going up. But then you have an entirely different subclass of society that doesn't own any stocks at all, and they're just noticing that life is getting harder. And so what's really going on? It was chilling, because like there's a degree to which you can liken that in the disconnect now, where it's like, I think it's I think it's sort of funny how we've become okay with the idea that you need to become tricked into holding X amount of dollars in a retirement account that's based on stocks.
Yep.
And if, Trump passes tariffs and that market crashes or something like this, then this deeply affects your stability post-retirement because you've been funneled into a system that makes it reliant on you needing to like park all of your value there.
This is a symptom of the, top-down economics versus the emergent kind of Austrian school. But and what's important, paying attention to the economy. Yeah, right now, what President Trump or Fed Chairman Powell says moves markets crazily. We've given them this power to intervene in markets to save us because of crises, and all we've really done is added a ton of noise and power over the system and concentrated it. And I don't know, I wish we didn't have to pay attention to that stuff. But like you said, the reality is what they say has a huge impact. And so I think for many people, Bitcoin has kind of been the off-ramp from that.
It's a place you can park value. And it's like, if I don't need that value in the next 1, 2, 10 years, I'm just going to leave it there and pretend it doesn't exist.
Now there's some assumptions in that, because unlike a stock or a business, we talked about this earlier, it doesn't produce cash flows. So it is a purely speculative asset, but I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. Like, most assets are speculative. Like, even people that own stocks are not buying them because of the 2% dividend yield and that they plan to retire off the 2% dividends of the earnings of that company. They're expecting that they're going to be able to sell those shares of stock to the younger generation for probably more than what they paid for them. And that's how that they're going to live. They're going to convert to cash. Well, that's no more or no less speculative than assuming that Bitcoin is going to go up in value. And I think there's a much more compelling argument that the demand for Bitcoin will continue to go up. But even if it doesn't, the fact that it has a fixed supply, and that a growing economy, we are continually producing more goods and services, the purchasing power of that Bitcoin should increase over time, even if demand does not increase. And whereas even if you own stocks, you don't get to control the issuance of that stock, how much they pay to employees and stock options, and diluting your ownership in that. And so to me, like, money, and in this case Bitcoin, is like the simplest, the least risky, the least number of risk factors in that. But you are still making a presumption that at least demand for Bitcoin is not going to fall over time. And so I think anyone that's considering purchasing Bitcoin needs to evaluate that. Like, it's not a foregone conclusion that Bitcoin just magically goes up in value. Like, you've got to think about what will people in the future, I will want to procure things for myself. I don't know exactly what that is. I can try to imagine what it is. What are the producers of those things going to want? Like, and getting back to kind of your first question, like, what do I wish I knew in my 20s of, about economics? Like, I think a lot of it is thinking about, so there's kind of 3 elements to the economy. You have production, consumption, and exchange. Like, when you're thinking about what you're going to produce, what you're going to do for work income, like, rather than focusing on like, how am I going to make money? Think about like, how can I provide value to others? Because there will always be an exchange there, whether you're exchanging that in dollars, whether you're exchanging that for Bitcoin, whether you're exchanging that in, barter if the whole world falls apart. I don't know. But if you are providing real value to others, you will be creating demand for your services. And so similarly, think about, and if you're on the other side selling something, like, what is it that you want to exchange your hard work for? Like, something that you hopefully will retain value, or at least that you think other people will demand. And I think over time, when I play it out, like, I think Bitcoin will be coming increasingly in demand for a savings asset that people want to hold.
How did you decide how you wanted to add value to others' lives?
So when I started, I don't know that I initially thought about it out of college. I was an accounting major, econ minor, and I had I was recruited before I had even graduated college to go into one of the accounting firms. And
what did they see in you?
So when I went into school, I was actually not planning to be an accounting major. I intended to do a double major of physics and economics. I had wanted to go into business, but wasn't specifically clear on what I wanted to do with that. Physics was supposed to be, I just enjoyed it and it was fun. I quickly realized I was not going to be able to, do physics as fun when everyone in that class was A, smarter than me, and B, all they were focusing on. And then as part of my econ, just general ed requirements, I had to take some accounting courses, and I was really good at it and enjoyed doing it. It was just like a big puzzle to me. And so I ended up going down the accounting, path because I was good at it and because at the time I really enjoyed it. And there was something comforting. I graduated basically at the bottom of the 2008 financial crisis in, spring of 2009, literally the bottom. And I was one of the few people that had a job lined up. So I thought things were going great. And then I kind of got into that world and realized this is really boring. I'm dealing with everything that's already happened in the past. I'm spending half my time just documenting what I'm doing rather than actually doing something. And the better I do at my job, the more conflict it creates. I was an auditor. So we were auditing public companies, their financial systems that they're issuing quarterly and annually, and making sure that they're, accurate. And if I did my job really good, I could find all sorts of things that weren't right and that hadn't been followed, like proper accounting methods, not necessarily because of fraud, but just people make mistakes all the time. And that always creates friction because you're being hired by a company they want your stamp of approval on their financials, but they don't really want you coming in and finding all things that they did wrong. That makes their life harder.
They just want the stamp of
They
approval.
just want the stamp of approval is true. And so you're trying to, I just didn't like that dynamic. I want to be in a world where I am incentivized to do my job well. And the better I do my job, the more value that creates. So I quickly, after I got my CPA license, realized I need to make a change. And I found that what I was most curious about, what I was spending all my time reading wasn't new accounting bulletins about accounting practices. It was like personal finance. I was trying to figure out for myself, what do I need to do to thrive in this economy, in this world? How do I invest my saved capital? And so then I was like, all right, well, I could parlay this into kind of financial planning and sought that out. And for me, I didn't have an exact path other than I assumed that the things that I was trying to figure out would be valuable for others because they were applicable to anyone that had financial capital to invest, and that I just focused on trying to do a good job, and that worked out. Now, in a world where Bitcoin takes over and we now have savings and where we don't have to use investing savings, I think the role of someone that does what I do is probably greatly diminished. Right now, people don't save in money. They save in stocks and bonds and other assets. And that world will always exist. Anyone that wants to take on additional risk to grow their wealth in, say Bitcoin terms, will have to take some level of risk with it. But the difference is right now, if you don't want to invest, you hold dollars, the money supply in dollars expands about 7% a year. So think of you're swimming in a river that's flowing at 7 miles per hour.
When we're talking about the CPI inflation, right?
I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about that the money supply expands at 7% a year.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. So this is a good point. Let's pause here.
Yeah.
When we say inflation, or when inflation is said in the media, they're typically talking about price inflation. What's the price of this basket of goods, which is supposed to represent what an average consumer is purchasing, and that goes up. They want it to go up 2% a year. But we talked about how people are always choosing, engaging in transactions that increase the value of their lifestyle, their worth. And so entrepreneurs are out there creating new goods and services and building things. So innovation and technology naturally leads to more abundance. As we all build things and we all trade with each other, the world becomes more abundant. There's more stuff. And so our standard of living should be increasing at whatever rate of that technological progress is. Which means that if there was a fixed number of units of money, that each unit of money should be able to have more and more purchasing power over time, because there's the same amount of money and there's now more stuff that you can buy with it. And instead, we live in a world where things get more expensive every year. And so why is that? And I think this is something that people just take for granted. And in economics in school, we're taught, no, 2% inflation is good. That's the sign of a healthy economy. That's exactly what you want. That means things are going on. Deflation is really bad. But if you step back and think about it, deflation is the natural state of the world. Any society that is progressing and building things should be in a deflationary state. And how much cheaper should stuff be getting every year? I don't know. It's kind of hard to pinpoint. We don't have a good way of measuring that. But as a very crude analysis, you can say, okay, we're printing 7% well, the money supply is expanding. It's not directly all printed, but the money supply is expanding on average 7% a year. So if there was no additional goods and services, then things should maybe be getting more expensive by 7% a year. But they're not. They're only getting more expensive by, say, 3% a year. So maybe that difference there is the actual productivity growth. And so in a world where we didn't print money, maybe things are actually getting, say 3 to 4% cheaper every year. And then so you start with let's say a negative 4% deflationary rate, and then you expand the money supply 7%. Now you get to that positive 3% inflation rate. And basically we're having 7% of our purchasing power stolen from us every year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking of the 7% that was reported during COVID when it was more like 20%. And the way that they were turning that knob, and you should correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but as far as like that basket of goods that you referenced that makes up the consumer price index, the people that make up this basket of goods have the ability to say, well, instead of having a 1,000 square foot apartment that's $1,000 and there's been 10% inflation on this, so now that 1,000 square foot apartment is $1,100, we don't really want to record that 10% there. So instead, because of like what you're referring to in the creation of abundance, we're just going to say that the average American in this basket of goods now only needs like an 895 square foot apartment, and an 895 square foot apartment is only $1,010.
Yeah, it's even more insidious than that. But their response to that would be, and I think there probably are people working in there that do not think that they're doing anything bad. They think that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. But the rent thing is an interesting example. If you go back to the 80s, included in the basket was the price of housing. Mm-hmm. Meaning that think about, you asked like in your 20s, like right now, houses are way more expensive relative to the average income than they were even when I was in my 20s. And even then that was way more than when, generations prior. And that's not included in the consumer price index. Instead, they do owner's equivalent rent. So as the asset values of houses have gone way up, the rental rates have not gone up at the same pace. Mm-hmm. And so they are saying, well, we're not going to assume we're going to assume that people don't want to buy a house, just that they need to rent a house. And so we're going to put the rental rate in there in the inflation rate. And the reason they did that was that during the inflation of the 70s, they had this issue, whereas they were increasing rates to try to bring down inflation, that increased mortgage payments because interest rates go up, mortgage payments go up. And that was creating housing prices, that was causing the mortgage payments to be higher, which feeds into higher inflation. And so as they were raising rates, it was working against them because of the calculation of this. And so they had to change it to owner's equivalent rent to prevent that from happening again, where now they can raise rates and they don't have to include the cost of mortgage payments going up as continuing to drive inflation. And then the substitution is true. The example I often use is if you want to, buy, let's say you like to consume steak and, you've got the price of ribeyes or filet in the basket. Well, the price of those goes up. What do you as an individual consumer naturally have to do? You have to cut back. So maybe you buy ground beef instead. Well, now the
consumer
the
price
Bureau
index
of labor statistics says, oh, look, Ben no longer prefers steak. He prefers ground beef. We're going to exchange the steak in the basket for ground beef. And look, now inflation hasn't gone up as much. It's like, well, no, I wanted to consume steak. Example. It just got more expensive. Like my preferences haven't changed. My preferences only changed because the price changed. That's like a result of inflation. And so it is a problem. Like I think the more accurate measure is like the monetary base increasing, and that's closer to 7%, even when we're told inflation is only 2%. Like if you want to maintain your proportional level of wealth in the world, you need to be expanding at 7% a year, not 2 or 3% a year. Your income needs to be going up 7% a year. And the reason that economists will say that's good is that it very much tilts the scales in favor of policymakers and in place of corporations. If you are an employee at a company, you would have to every year argue for a 7% increase in your pay to stay even.
Yeah, which for context, right, is like unheard of. An average raise.
You're lucky to get an inflation increase, which is 2 or 3%.
Yeah, 2 or 3%.
And so reality is you're making less and less money every year in real purchasing power terms to what it should be than you are. And people say, oh, but prices aren't going up that much, just 2 or 3%. Yeah, but they should be going down. Mm-hmm. Like all that technological innovation and productivity gains is being scraped off and redistributed in whoever's basically closest to the money printer, or whoever they decide. But
And it's hard to define what the shape of the solution for this looks like, because I was like, by default, for, reasons that we've been talking about, like not a proponent of things like, increases of the minimum wage, until I like looked at the divergence of these things over time, where it's like, here's the graph that shows the increase in average wage over time, and here's the graph that shows the wage and the increase of buying power. And like digging down this rabbit hole, if you were to price the purchasing power of factory line workers in Henry Ford's factory in terms of like how much gold they could have bought at that time, and put it forward to today's buying power, they were getting about $142,000 per year in terms of purchasing power measured against gold, not against the inflation that's reported between that period and this period.
I believe it. Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe that's probably exactly accurate.
Which is crazy. And so like, you might not have an answer to this because it's a complex question, but like, what are the types of things that could lead, other than reshaping the entire system, what are the ways that individuals may be taking the conversation back in that direction? If you're someone that's in a position like this and you're trying to hedge against behavior that's being taken place at the level of like your government that's setting monetary policy and partaking in this behavior, what are the ways that you can hedge against that aren't necessarily to the point before, like, I feel like this necessity to dump things in stocks is sort of sinister as well, in the sense that like there's an attention tax on that, because you do have to pay attention to world events, because the world events are going to inhibit your ability to retire based off of like the bets that you're making on stocks.
I mean, I'm obviously a proponent of Bitcoin. I think that actually is probably the solution that doesn't solve all the world's problems, but it solves a lot of them. I think many of the symptoms we see of what's broken in the world today flow from a broken monetary system, that I think at least replacing the base layer of that with a hard money like Bitcoin wouldn't solve that through just natural incentives without having to have new regulations and policies trying to force people to do things. But on an individual level, you don't have much control over that. Like that, I think is slowly emerging over time from the bottom up. There's right now maybe some influence coming from the top down of ushering that in, but I'm skeptical of that and would never count on that actually coming to fruition. I sometimes think that policymakers that are in support of, or seemingly in support of Bitcoin, don't fully recognize that if they actually usher Bitcoin in, they will lose their power. And are they really ready to give that up? But I think on an individual level, acknowledging or recognizing that and not relying on these policymakers and the governments to save you and figure out what you can do in your own life. I think it's going to be, choosing what you do with work, finding things that are actually providing value to people, not just wherever they're providing stimulus and encouraging you to go. Think of like, what would other people find valuable, and focus on that. I also think in a world where you have, people are worried about AI, like, in anything, but maybe it's just becoming more true. Like, if you're one of the best at what you do in whatever field, you're going to be valuable to somebody. And if you want to be one of the best at what you do, you need to spend a lot of time honing that craft. And to do that, you probably need to at least somewhat enjoy what you're doing. And so rather than choosing what career to go in based on, where they say the future jobs are going to be and where the demand currently is, I think it's finding that balance of, yes, somewhat follow your passion, of like, find something that is an interesting problem for yourself that you really want to dig into, and just get really good at that. And have that long-term focus and commitment to it, but also keep your eyes open, be willing to pivot. As you can see far on the horizon, you want to know what direction you're going, but as you approach that point, you can now see even further on the horizon. And if you see somewhere else you want to go, don't be scared to pivot. So it's finding this right balance of commitment, but also flexibility. Like, you don't want to leave all your options always open and never commit to anything, or you'll just be adrift and go nowhere. But you don't want to put yourself down such a tight and narrow pathway that you can't ever change it. And then in terms of what you save in, I think exploring things that can't be debased easily, which could be real estate classically. My only issue with real estate is it's already, I think, very expensive. But the fundamental qualities of it, yes. I think the reason it's expensive is because people have seen that as, I need to put my wealth in something that can't be easily printed, and real estate is one of those things.
Was the, this is a little bit of a loaded question, but something I've been thinking about. Did you see the thing like 2 weeks ago that was like 60% of the people who went to Coachella financed their tickets? I
didn't know that, but that doesn't shock me.
Yeah, like have you heard of these services like Klarna? Do you
Is
know?
that like a firm and all these, where everything you buy? I mean, every time I go buy anything online, it lets me put it into
Yes,
installment
it's
payments
like
now.
I'm gonna check out on Amazon. I'm buying $150 worth of stuff, but instead of spending $150 now, don't worry, Klarna will make it so that I can only
Yeah.
pay $7 a month for the next 2 years, right? When in like the end of the day, you're
So
paying double
this
for the
is
same
more
amount
debt.
of
Like this,
goods.
the amount of debt and credit in our system just continually expands, and it has to, or the system collapses in itself. If people stop buying things, one person's consumption is another's income, and that person needs the income to pay off their debt. And so everyone's incentivized to continue stimulating and pumping up the system, because the reality is it is somewhat of a house of cards. And if it ever goes in the reverse direction for too long, it collapses. And so my base case of how I think of what people will, policymakers will do, is that we're not going to pay down the debt. Like, we're not. Like, great to cut around the edges and reduce wasteful spending, but there is no way we're paying off the debt, because it would bring about, some sort of depression. We are going to continue to expand the money supply. And so therefore, how do you protect yourself? It's by owning scarce things, owning things like gold, owning things like Bitcoin, owning things like real estate, your own means of production, your own income source. And in many ways, my base case for Bitcoin being successful isn't that the world falls into Armageddon scenario. Like, actually, I think that's really bad for Bitcoin. In a world where that happens, there are no goods and services to buy with my Bitcoin. Like, the essentials become the most valuable thing, and everything else falls in value relative to that. The bullish case for Bitcoin is actually that the world continues on in the direction it is, and actually just accelerates. And this finite thing that you're holding, the scarce thing you're holding, just continues to go up in purchasing power, because everything else is spinning around. When you have abundance on this side, AI and everything else creating, and then you have this scarce thing here, each unit of that scarce asset has more and more purchasing power, and that all you have to do is buy and hold it. Now, the time scale on which this happens is, I don't know. Like, all of the problems and the quote broken money things that I'm bringing up here, people have been screaming about this since 1913, when the Fed was created. The gold bugs have been screaming about it, hard since the 70s, when we fully delinked from the gold standard. And it's been, a century or at least 50 years since the 70s, and it still hasn't broken yet. So like, this game can go on a really long time. That if you're someone that already has financial capital, is financially independent, like most of my clients are retirees. We're not putting everything in Bitcoin. We're putting some of it in Bitcoin, because I need to make sure that they're going to be okay no matter what happens and over what time scale. Somebody younger, most of their wealth is in their human capital, their future earning potential. In most cases, unless they have already had financial success by selling a company or having inheritance, like, their financial capital represents a relatively small amount of their overall wealth. And while I can never recommend making a concentrated bet on anything, like, I don't think it's crazy if that person decides to put pretty much everything that they don't need for the short term, like reserve money, like down payment on a house, spending needs if they lose their job, into Bitcoin. Like, is it risky? Yeah, but it also sounds very risky to me to assume that I'm going to, save 10% and put it in stocks and hope that compounds, and someday, have $1 million when the $1 million won't buy anything, someday. So like, it's a really hard thing to figure out what you should do. And it's all going to be dependent on your specific situation. But I increasingly believe that the way the current system is structured, the can has been kicked down the road so far, and the bill has been passed to future generations, that like, if that future doesn't look good to you, there are ways to protect yourself without, you can kind of take that off ramp financially, and then still participate in normal society in the world, and make your money there, and be okay with this happening on whatever time scale and however it unfolds.
David, I know you have things to run to this morning. Otherwise, I could talk to you about the economy for a long time. Say a few words about what you're most passionate about in regards to what you do, and how you spend your time.
So I have a financial advisory business. We work mostly with retirees. I spend a lot of my time reading and thinking about the economy, and looking out on the horizon of like what could happen, and trying to we don't take a very active tactical approach. I'm more trying to look at getting these long-term themes right, of where things are going, and being positioned that we're going to be okay no matter what happens. And more than anything, trying to reduce that left tail risk of like the really bad events that could crater it. So that's like my day job. And then I've got 3 kids. I'm busy with that. And I'm lucky that one of my natural interests is just like money and how things work, the world works through a monetary lens. So the part that I love most about my job is all of that. And then by, taking on clients, that's how I'm able to provide value to others and make it all work. And right now I don't have a lot of hobbies outside of my kids and family and work. I have things on the horizon that as I have more time and energy, I'll probably, start doing again or tackle, but.
Cool, man. Well, I've learned a lot through my friendship with you, and I'm really grateful that you were willing to come on and say a little bit about what you know about the economy and how people that are closer to my generation can think about building resiliency for themselves. So
Likewise, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.